Hello, my name is Monica Elliott, and I'm the Voter Services Chair for the League of Women Voters of Broward County and for the State League. And I'm sure that most of you already know that redistricting is normally done every 10 years after the US Census is completed. So I'm going to share my screen and we will get started. Oops. And of course, yep, there it goes. And if somebody can do a thumbs up, Allie, can you put a thumbs up? I can see
Yeah.
you, that you can see
Yes.
my screen.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So now what we're seeing right now is this mid-decade redistricting. It's not normal and is clearly being done for partisan political gain. And this is what represents an alarming change in our country. But first, of course, we're going to talk about the League and what we do for those of you who may not be familiar with the League. So we are an organization that formed 105 years ago as the 19th Amendment, when women were obtaining the right to vote, was being ratified across the US. We are nonpartisan. We have always been nonpartisan, but we're a grassroots organization that's dedicated to encouraging informed participation in government. The League is nonpartisan because we never support or oppose candidates or political parties. However, we are political because we educate and advocate on issues our members determine are important to democracy. Today, we are definitely advocating. Just an overview of the agenda. We're going to quickly look at what is redistricting, the redistricting landscape today, talk about Florida, and put a little bit of focus on Broward County because we have been doing fair districting correctly. Then we'll talk about the Florida League's position, some advocacy suggestions, and Q&A. And I would like to ask that if you do have questions, to put them in the chat, and then we will deal with them all at the end. So first, we'll start off with doing a quick look at redistricting. So every 10 years, the US Census Bureau counts the US population and uses the updated counts to determine which state populations have increased or decreased. And then these new population counts are used to determine the number of US representatives that each state in the country receives. Now, by federal law, the size of the House of Representatives is set at 435 seats, and it hasn't changed in a very long time. Excuse me. But the number of elected representatives and their districts do change over time, every time we do the redistricting. But the first part is what we call apportionment. And then we go into the redistricting. So with apportionment, we know that the data released in 2020 census that Florida and 5 other states saw increased population. So they each gained a district and therefore 1 congressional representative, an additional one. Now, Texas was the only state that gained 2 districts and therefore 2 representatives. The redistricting is the actual process of creating the maps that determine the boundaries for these electoral districts. And redistricting is done for both Congress, the House of Representatives, and then also for the state legislatures. So the states have the responsibility of determining the maps for their federal and state districts. It's not done by Congress. It is done by the states. And each state has a different way that they go about setting the boundaries for their representatives at the federal and the state legislature. Some have independent commissions. Some, like Florida, use the legislature. And then by determining, excuse me a moment, I have a frog in my throat. Okay, there we go. By determining which neighborhoods are going to be included in each map boundary, this redistricting, it's going to impact how communities are represented in the US Congress, at the state level, and then also at local government. And then it also determines how resources are going to get redistributed. In the ideal world, each state would create fair district maps for federal and state districts. But as we know, not all electoral maps are drawn fairly. And in fact, you have probably heard the word gerrymandering, and we'll give you just a little bit of history about this. So gerrymandering is, by definition, the manipulation of electoral boundaries to the disadvantage of a group of voters based on their political views or race. The term gerrymander dates to 1812, when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, and it's spelled Gerry, signed into law a redistricting plan that included a district that many thought looked like a salamander. And that's what you see in that top left-hand corner. And so that's why it was nicknamed gerrymander. So a political party, and both parties do it. This is both Republicans and Democrats. They use partisan gerrymandering to craft maps that lock in an outsized share of seats for their party. And what we see in the lower left-hand corner is the map that shows gerrymandering in Florida's 5th congressional district that happened in 2012. And this occurred after the Fair Districts Amendments passed. And I'll explain those in a minute. But you can see in that lower left photo that the original map for the 5th congressional district, I mean, that looks like a salamander also. And you can see that it was following the dictates of gerrymandering, which is not allowed, or is not allowed by the Fair Districts Amendments. So redistricting that's occurring today, why are we hearing so much about it? Because we already did this in 2021 and 2022, and the next US Census isn't until 2030. So the talk of the mid-decade redistricting this year began in Texas when President Trump called for 5 more US House seats in Texas, with the stated objective to gain more Republican House seats. And despite great public opposition, the Texas legislature voted in August to move forward with redistricting. So then the movement spread to a Democratic state, which is California, and they will vote to allow changes to their redistricting process in an attempt to counter Texas' impact. And then there's other states that are discussing redistricting also. Indiana, Ohio, Missouri just passed new maps, New Jersey, Nebraska, Maryland, and of course, Florida. Florida is looking at not just redistricting congressional lines, but also requesting an additional seat in the US House. And we'll look more closely at Florida in a few minutes. But the point is, both parties across the country, they're trying to control the outcome of the 2026 elections to gain more seats in Congress. And this is all before a single voter has had their votes heard. So is it even legal? Well, at least 11 states, not Florida, have explicitly prohibited the legislature from mid-decade redistricting, congressional mid-decade redistricting, or both in their constitution. According to a new Pew Research Center analysis, mid-decade redistricting efforts like the ones in Texas and California have, up until now, been extremely uncommon. Since 1970, only 2 states, Texas in 2003 and then this year, and Georgia in 2005, have voluntarily, and that's the key word, voluntarily redrawn their congressional maps between census for partisan advantage. Now, districts have been drawn or redrawn by court orders during a decade, but only Texas and Georgia have thus far voluntarily redrawn districts in the middle of the decade. I guess we can add Missouri to that now. In Florida, our Constitution in Article 3 states that the legislature at its regular session in the second year following each decennial census by a joint resolution shall apportion the state. And we did that. We've already done that. But that's what it says in the Constitution. It never talks about mid-decade redistricting. The US Constitution, it requires that the states use decennial census data to redistrict. Again, no mention of mid-decade redistricting. So there's also some federal protections in place for redistricting. One is the Federal Voting Rights Act, which under certain circumstances guarantees non-white populations the opportunity to elect the candidate of their choice. And then there is the US Constitution Equal Protection Clause, which prohibits race from predominating during the redistricting process. So what is the League of Women Voters in the United States, their position on this mid-decade redistricting? So I'm going to quote from Selena Stewart from an August 5th position statement that she made. She is our CEO of LWVUS. The League of Women Voters does not support a tit-for-tat approach to redistricting. State legislatures redrawing their maps mid-cycle reflects political gamemanship that erodes public trust in our democracy. Redistricting must be fair, transparent, and rooted in the voices of voters, not partisan retaliation. Manipulating maps for political gain is a disservice to the people. The League stands for maps that reflect communities, not political calculations. Voters deserve stable, fair representation, not to be used as pawns in a power grab. When politicians rewrite the rules mid-game to protect their control, democracy loses. The League of Women Voters is ready to fight to ensure fairness for voters, no matter what politicians do for their own gain. We stand ready to protect the voices of all voters because that is what our democracy is built on. So now we're going to focus on Florida. Florida, we definitely have a history of gerrymandering. Both sides, Democrats, Republicans. But this eventually prompted the passage of the Fair District Amendments to the Florida Constitution in 2010. And since their passage, the League of Women Voters of Florida has been advocating that the legislature adhere to these amendments. So again, long history of gerrymandering in Florida. But in 2008, the League and its coalition of partners composed two citizen initiative ballot amendments, number 5 and number 6, that were proposed. These amendments are what we refer to as the Fair Districts Amendments. These establish criteria that congressional and state legislative districts must meet. What's the difference between 5 and 6? They both are concerned with redistricting, but Amendment 6 deals with congressional districts, and Amendment 5 deals with the state and legislative districts. Otherwise, the text are exactly the same. And then what the League of Women Voters did, one of the things we're best at is we collected petitions to get these two amendments, 5 and 6, on the ballot. And then we did encourage and advocate for Florida voters to vote yes. And they did. There was a 63% voter passage of these two amendments. 63%. So we went past that 60% threshold. But the passage of the Fair District Amendments, that was reflecting the will of the everyday Floridians. And that is put into and is still in the Constitution. And just a reminder in terms of what these actually state, the primary, there's some secondary reasoning behind it, but the primary Fair District provisions require that district lines not be drawn to favor one political party over another, not be drawn to harm voting power of racial or language minorities, and that they are to be contiguous. Now, these are to be applied for the U.S. House of Representatives, the Florida Senate, and the Florida House. But the Florida legislature didn't follow the new Fair District Amendments. They totally ignored them when we went to the 2012 redistricting. So despite their promise to adhere to the Fair Districts criteria, the Florida legislature immediately violated the Fair District Amendments in 2012. And they did this for both the federal, state Senate, and state House districts. So the two maps I'm showing here at the upper right-hand side, that was Congressional District 5 that the legislature drew. It took years of litigation and extended involvement from the League and our coalition partners to finally get fair congressional maps. And in fact, what you see at the bottom left-hand side, and that's just showing, District 5, this is the court-appointed congressional map. And that was submitted by, these maps were submitted by the League and our coalition partners. In other words, the Florida Supreme Court agreed with the League and our coalition partners so that we would have fair maps going forward. And these remained in place until redistricting was done again in 2022. And this is what the map has looked like for the elections in 2016, 2018, and 2020. And again, I want to emphasize that this congressional map, it only came about because the League of Women Voters of Florida and other coalition partners, we fought for this in court for fair districts. So we're not going to stop doing this. Now I'm going to detour into looking at Broward County, because I think it's important to understand what we have done, what we have accomplished in Broward County. So in 2018, 85%, I mean, that's a huge number, 85% of Broward voters said yes to incorporating the Fair District Amendment principles into the Broward County Charter. And that's what you see the major principles in the blue box on the left-hand side. But we actually even went further, and we voted to include the process by which the maps could be drawn. Our charter here in Broward County requires the county to retain a public Florida college or university to draw the county commission districts. So in 2021, after this had passed, FIU was chosen, Florida International University, was chosen to draw the district maps. They provided 4 maps to the county commission to select from. And then with public input, they decided on one particular map. So what I'm showing you here is, again, we have to remember, redistricting is based on census data. And this illustrates the changes which had occurred in Broward County population between 2010 and 2020. There was overall population increase of 11.2%. There was an almost 40% increase in the Hispanic population between 2010 and 2020. And then on the bottom 2 lines, of the non-Hispanic or Latino populations, there was a 15% decrease in the white population and a 15% increase in the Black population. And this resulted in a total, population in the county being very close to 1/3 white, 1/3 Black, and 1/3 Hispanic. But unfortunately, and I know this slide is going to be hard to see, but I'm using a table from the FIU presentation and I can't really manipulate it. But these are the pre-2022 county commission district numbers that you're seeing, the 9 districts. That third set of numbers in the pale blue is the partisan lean of each district prior to 2020. Not surprising, Broward is a highly Democratic, party county. But then the next set of numbers, these are the old demographic district numbers, pre-2022. And what they show you is how skewed the voting population in each district was toward white voters. There was a few exceptions. prior to 2022, there was only one clear Hispanic district. There was one clear Black district, and then there was one district that was essentially split between Hispanic and Black voters. But what we accomplished in 2022 was a map that actually reflected Broward's diversity. So that we now have 2 districts with a majority Black population, and that's districts 8 and 9. We have 2 districts with a majority or near majority of Hispanics, and that's in District 1 and 7. And then we have 2 districts with a majority or near majority white population of districts 4 and 5. And then the remaining 3 districts, which are highlighted in gray, are close to the 1/3 each Hispanic, Black, and white. Because you have to remember, they have to have an equal population within these districts. So there's a limited, you get to a point where you just can't massage these numbers too much in order to get the lines, because they're also trying to adhere as much as possible to natural boundaries also. But this is the way fair districting is supposed to work. And no other county in Florida has adopted the fair district principles. And I think it is something that Broward County should actually be recognized for, that we did incorporate the fair district principles into our county charter, and we have used them, and we can see the difference that it has made in the county. Okay, so now back to the sad story of Florida and our governor and legislature and their flagrant violation of the fair district amendments in our Constitution. After the 2020 census, when it was time to begin redistricting in 2022, the Florida legislature actually started out following the fair district standards. But when they enacted, finally, a map, it was created by the governor. It really wasn't a map that was created by the legislature. Again, they had actually done fairly well. But then the governor got involved, and they enacted a racially discriminatory congressional map that stripped the Black voters of fair representation by eliminating that majority Black district in the northern part of the state. The League, along with our usual partners, immediately sued. But in July of this year, July 2025, the Florida Supreme Court, which is a vastly different composition than it was in 2015, they upheld the congressional map that was created by DeSantis. The Florida Supreme Court rejected the challenge by the League and our partners to stop this match. Essentially, they voted to, keep a map that clearly violated the Florida Constitution's Fair District Amendments that was passed by the voters in 2010. The court ruled that restoring the district, which covered North Florida, would be an impermissible racial gerrymandering under the U.S. Constitution. And again, just comparing the map that we had fought for in 2015, this is Congressional District 5 at the top in the purple. And essentially what the legislature did in terms of enacting what Governor DeSantis had put forth was they divided that district from north to south, and we had lost the Black representation in that area. So where are we at now? Well, we are at a point where the governor has proposed mid-decade congressional redistricting in Florida. It came from the governor. He first mentioned this in July of 2025. And the reason, he mentions it then is this was immediately after they had won the Supreme Court victory that redrew the maps. And he was hoping for 2 outcomes. He would like to be awarded another seat in the U.S. House of Representatives, going from 28 seats to 29. He argues that the state was undercounted in the 2020 census. However, if that happens, well, that means another state is going to have to lose a seat. We'll see what happens there. Whether or not that happens, he still wants to redistrict our congressional seats. Again, that's going to change some district lines. So that was in July. Then in September, State House Speaker Daniel Perez has appointed a select committee to look at drawing up new districts. No public hearings have yet been held, and no draft maps have been released to the public. And that's kind of important. There could be maps drawn and we just don't know about, because that's what they've done before. But thus far, no Senate committee has been appointed. And this slide just illustrates, these are the names of the House Select Committee on Congressional Redistricting that were selected by the House Speaker. He was very careful to select people who were not involved with the last redistricting. So essentially, they're coming in new to this process. And then the insert is the current official congressional map. So again, I kind of want to convert back to Broward County just a little bit, because that's where it's going to have the greatest effect. Again, the goal of Governor DeSantis is to gain more Republican seats in Congress from Florida. Right now, only 8 of the 28 congressional seats are held by Democrats. There's 2 in Central Florida, there's 1 on the West Coast, and then there's 5 centered around Broward County. So in the left-hand map, I've circled those areas that are Democratic districts. Then on the right-hand side is a close-up of the 5 congressional districts centered around Broward County held by Democrats. So Frankel is in southern Palm Beach, Sherfless, McCormick, Moskowitz, Wasserman Schultz, those all include Broward County. And then Frederico Wilson contains a very small portion of southeastern Broward County. So these are the 5 districts with Broward County in the center. So what is the League's position? Obviously, we do oppose it. The League of Women Voters of US has historically advocated for following the core principles regarding redistricting in general. We advocate for independent commissions. The responsibility for drawing maps should be given to an independent commission to avoid partisan gerrymandering. Maps should be drawn to ensure effective representation for racial and linguistic minority groups. The process should protect and preserve communities of interest. The entire redistricting process must be open and include citizen participation at all levels. Map drawing must explicitly reject considering factors that provide an unfair advantage, such as partisan affiliation, incumbent protection, or a candidate's residence. This is the position by LWV US. It is also the League of Women Voters of Florida position. In an interview that LWVFL President Jessica Lowe Minor has given, and this was on August 18th, she noted, the legislature should not ignore the will of the people. In 2010, 63% of Floridians said they did not want our state's districts drawn on a partisan basis, that they did not want them to be drawn with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. This mid-decade redistricting talk appears to be less about population shifts and more about political advantage. We think it's very clear that this is a power grab and that this is something our state constitution expressly prohibits. And again, the blue box on the right side is a reminder of the Fair Districts Amendment language. 63% of the voters said yes to this. We've never actually had, in our entire country's history, a mid-cycle census. I mean, that's going to require a huge national effort for that to occur. But you can't do redistricting without new census data. There's no justification for it otherwise. The other thing is, here we are 15 years later after we passed the Fair District Amendments. and they're still trying to use partisan redistricting to get what they want to get. There's no reason from the league's perspective to redo the current map at this time, and certainly not without any new census numbers to justify the effort. In a democracy, voters choose the politicians. Politicians do not choose the voters. We would prefer that our elected officials focus on kitchen table issues, things that are affecting our everyday life. The rising healthcare costs, the rising cost of homeowners insurance, property taxes, housing affordability, education, the fact that it costs so much to go buy food at the grocery store. These are the things that our legislature and our governor need to be focusing on, not trying to rig the system to benefit themselves. So what can we do? But before we talk about things you can do to advocate for no redistricting, there was a recent poll that came out from Common Cause. Common Cause is a nonpartisan 501c4 organization like the League. And they commissioned the Noble Predictive Insights to conduct multiple polls on redistricting. And this included an over 2,000 person national poll and then a 499 person Florida poll. And this was conducted in the field between August 26th and September 2nd. And the findings show broad opposition to mid-decade redistricting from Democrats, Republicans, and those no party affiliation voters in Florida. This is including people who did support Donald Trump in the 2024 presidential election. So 55% of the Floridians reject mid-decade redistricting. And when you break it down by party, it was 45% opposition from Republicans, 60% opposition from NPAs and no party affiliates, and 62% from those registered as Democrats. The overwhelming majority of voters in Florida, 76%, support independent commissions made up of citizens to draw the district lines instead of the state lawmakers. Also in this poll, it shows 66% of Floridians support Congress banning maps that favor one political party over another. And the same percentage, 66%, support Congress banning maps during the mid-decade redistricting. So we do have to be aware of the changing landscape. Lots of things are going to happen in the next few months. So we need to be aware if the committee is meeting, what is being pushed. Will they try to do somehow grab another seat from another state? Highly unlikely, but you just never know these days. So we just have to be sure that we're following the news, we're reading trusted media, and then watch for what the statements are coming from the local league and our state league. One thing we should be keeping in mind is the cost associated with mid-decade redistricting. For well over a decade now, Florida taxpayers have borne the cost of repeated litigation to try to uphold the fair district requirements. These are the requirements that 63% of the voters agreed to. There's the potential special legislative session costs, litigation costs, and then also think about the costs associated at the local level in each county from the supervisor elections. Because once you start changing any congressional district lines, it's going to affect how precincts look and everything associated with redistricting. So those are extra expenses we have to deal with. We want to be sure that everyone is counted equal. It should be about the people and the communities that share culture, language, and lived experiences. Fair maps mean counting everyone equally, playing by the rules, having a transparent process, doing it in full view of the public and with the public input. Historically, when maps change due to the normal redistricting process after a census, there's voter confusion. And if we do it during the middle of a decade, that's going to even lead to more confusion. And then we know what they're trying to do is silence, excuse me, They're trying to silence communities and take the power away from the people. Again, voters should choose their politicians, not the other way around. In Florida, we have enshrined those fair districts into our state constitution, and we are just simply going to have to keep a watch on what the legislature is doing. It is up to the legislature. The governor can try to push the legislature to do his bidding, which is what happened in 2022. We'll just have to wait and see what happens in the next year. So these are certain things that you can do: write letters and call your state rep and state senator, attend your local legislative delegation meeting. The next meeting for Broward County is October 27th. That will be the first public hearing legislative delegation meeting. Share this information. This presentation is being recorded, and we will put it on YouTube, and certainly, reach out to your friends and families. Try to explain to them what is going on and why the league is opposing this so adamantly. Just some important dates that are coming up. The legislature actually starts committee weeks next week. Again, so far, the Special Committee on Congressional Redistricting has not scheduled a meeting. Right now, they've been focused on the property taxes, but next week we start the regular legislative committee weeks. The first day of session is not until January 13th. Another window, or another time to look at, is that federal candidates, they start filing between April 20th and 24th. So you've got to have some sort of, if you're going to have a new map, it's got to be in place by that time. So it's a very short window on which to do this work, and because this is difficult work to do. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, and then if there are questions, I'll try to answer them as best I can. So Bonnie asked the question that Florida redistricting seems to be clearly violate the Florida Constitution and US Constitution. Wouldn't it eventually be tossed out as unconstitutional? One would think so, but this all depends on the judges. So, and we see this so clearly here in Florida because, for example, the league and our associates won the lawsuit in 2015 when we were challenging the 2012 maps. But then 10 years later, you have a totally different Florida Supreme Court, and we see a totally different interpretation of, in this case, the US Constitution, as to how that should be affecting our redistricting. And so the league lost in 2025. And this is where you see who is on the court can affect those outcomes. And the people who are selecting the Florida Supreme Court, US Supreme Court justices, goes back to who you elect for governor and president. I'll read one more question in the chat before I take Denise's hand. I see her hand is up. So redistricting itself is legal under Florida law, but mid-decade redistricting, which is being done now without new census data, may violate the Florida Constitution. And that is what we would probably argue. I mean, the league is ready to go to court if new maps are drawn and they are drawn against the fair district's principles. Denise, you have your hand up.
Yes, my question is, you're suggesting that we write our Florida representative and senator. Can we, or is there any benefit to writing to people on the select committee on congressional redistricting? Is there any benefit to that, or?
Yes, and in fact, for those of you who have signed up for the postcard party this afternoon, and we certainly have more room to do that, that's who we're going to be writing to. Really the target should be first the special House district the Special House Committee on Congressional Redistricting in the state legislature. We're not saying to write your US Congress representatives or US senators. We're just dealing with the state. And so, yes, we should be contacting the members of that special committee, and then also contacting our local legislative delegation to encourage them to talk to the members of that special committee, to let them know, this is how Broward County voters, feel about it.
So if we're not attending the postcard party, is there a list available, readily available that we can all use, or does that make sense?
Yes, if you sign up, go to the redistricting day event.
Okay.
Yeah, and you sign up for like the email, and correct me, Denise Elliott, but they will be sent the email addresses of the committee members, correct?
Yes, that's correct. They get
Okay.
there's a link. They actually sent a link to be able to download the list of those senators that includes their email addresses.
And we'll get that today, or should we have gotten it already?
Well, if you have signed up for that particular activity, that's when it goes out.
I thought I had, so I'll need to.
Well, if
try
you
that
check,
again.
if you used that confirmation email for this event, it's also on there as well. If you signed up for both, the links
Okay.
are on the same
Perfect.
confirmation.
Thank you. So much comes our way. I thank you.
Yes. So Diane Phillips is asking if another state would lose a seat if Florida gains one, how's that decision made? We don't know. The only way a reapportionment occurs is with census data. Now, the census does update data between, the major counting, but it's not the same as the major counts that they do at the decennial census. So that's really when Governor DeSantis talks about, Florida didn't get enough seats, that there should be a recount. I mean, it would have to literally be a true census count. And I don't think anybody really sees that happening. But in this environment, never say never. But it would have to be a total recount, and they would go through the normal apportionment process to determine who had lost population, who had gained population. One thing I'd like to point out is that the Florida government did not put any money into the 2020 census. It was pretty much all done at the local level, versus other states which did put significant funds into the census. So I think in some ways we can say Florida itself is to blame if we didn't get the extra congressional seat that DeSantis wants. If we'd had better counts, we might have gotten another congressional seat. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you this morning. And again, this was recorded. We will be putting it onto YouTube, and I'm going to stop the recording now.